Okay, quickly. Belle asked yesterday about oh God, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. It is too long for me to read for these videos. So what I'm going to do is I'm trying to find an audiobook that I can upload to Google Classroom for you to listen to. It just won't be me. Okay. So, but I am still doing Brian's Hunt for you, and I'm going to read chapter 2. I'm probably going to fly through it as fast as I can, and y'all just catch how many errors I can make. Okay. All right. Thanks. All right, he glided along the lily pads in the sun, half looking for fish he might eat, and let his mind float back a couple of months. He had returned to his world, the wilderness. He had sworn that he wouldn't. Once he'd gone back to civilization, even when he found that once he was 16, he could actually quit school if he wanted to, and his parents' consent. But he didn't want to do that because he discovered that this was an incredible thing that happened with studying. You actually learned things. It sounded dumb when he thought of it, kind of like, duh, really, like, no kidding. But before the plane crashed, so much of his schooling had been simply getting by, trying to learn just enough to pass the test and never really knowing anything. When he had gone back, he started to run into things in books. That was how it had happened at first. He'd been in the bush and survived with only a hatchet because he'd begun to try to learn about things that happened to him, basic things, even idiotic things. You eat the gut cherries, you throw them up. Don't eat the gut cherries. It sounded silly when he thought of it, but it was a simple way. But when he'd gone back and after the furor of his survival had finished and all the television and media hype was done and all the doctors had examined him to make sure he was all right, he tried to get his life back to normal. But he never really had, of course, because he had been in a place so completely different. He found that he looked at everything the way he had in the bush when his decisions were a matter of life or death. If a teacher handed him a history book, he didn't just scan it and learn the dates of the Battle of Gettysburg or when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. He had a great thirst to understand, to know things that he had known from in the bush, to know. And so he tried to find out more about everything that came to him, tried to learn about what was happening in Gettysburg, and came to find that it was not just simply in history to take a test about. It was an appalling battle where over 50,000 American soldiers were slaughtered in 3 days at horrendous fighting, and so thick were the bullets flying at each other that you could still find bullets swagged together because they hit in flight in the air and fell to the ground. He learned about Minnesota First Volunteers, that 262 who started the battle. Only 47 were left standing. So out of 262 soldiers who started that battle, only 47 of them were left standing, but most of those were wounded. And Alexander Graham Bell didn't invent the phone. He is actually trying to find a way to help deaf children communicate with their parents, and he came very close to inventing the airplane before Wilbur and Orville Wright. Brian learned these things and he knew them. And though he had come back to the bush now because he couldn't be with people back in civilization and because he knew he would probably never fit in, he did not hate school or the concept of studying or learning. And he did not hate his parents. He loved them. He wanted to see if there was some way he could make the two worlds work together, but he could not. Their world was ugly to him and was filled with awful tastes and smells, and people, all they wanted was what he thought about things, and it was wrong. Wanted that, things. They just wanted money and the right cars and the right girls and the right clothes. At first, he could somehow tolerate how they lived, and he tried to find a way to make it work for him as well. But at the end of the 2 years, he simply just could not stand it. He had reached some situation point, some saturation point, some point he just couldn't take it anymore, where he could watch television. He could not listen to the discordant loud music. He could not stand traffic noise. He hated the fact that it was dark at night and he couldn't see the stars because of the city lights. He went into a state of overload and a kind of shock and open disbelief that people could actually live or pretend to live the way that they did. So he had worked out of a way to homeschool on his own up here. He had brought some paperback textbooks with him, one on history, another on math, one on nature and biology. He'd already found some errors in that one, especially concerning how animals think, and even if they do clinically think. Several books on literature, and of course his Shakespeare. And he'd promised his parents and the school that after he'd studied them, he would take a test to prove he knew the things, and then the next year they might try more books and more tests. This procedure wasn't openly accepted, but the school authorities gave him credit for the surviving 54 days with nothing but a hatchet. They acknowledged that it showed an ability to learn. Everyone was trying to be flexible because it was clear that he really did want to learn. There, he stopped, back paddled the canoe until it didn't move. Under a lily pad, lying still, was a small green log. It was a large northern pike, 4, maybe 5 pounds. In some dumb fishing magazine he'd seen in a doctor's office, he read an article that said northern pike were not good to eat because they were a series of floating Y bones down their sides that made it so you couldn't fillet them, couldn't cut steaks off the sides of them very easily. It also said that they were kind of slimy. The truth is, all fish are slimy because they're covered with an antibacterial coating to keep disease out. The way Brian cooked them, with the guts out, but otherwise whole on a flat piece of wood facing the fire, the slime turned a nice blue and came off with the skin. In a cookbook, he found that the French have a recipe called au bleu, where they bake a fish and serve it on a platter blue with all the slime. Still, he thought, it's a long way from looking at the northern under a lily pad to actually eating one. They were first-class predator, would take not just another fish, but frogs, ducklings, baby loons, and now and then they've been known to bite people. Like all good predators, they were fast and very cautious. Predators could not afford to be hurt, even a minor injury or a death sentence, because they could not catch their prey. He had brought some line and a few small hooks, but he rarely used them. It was much easier and more selective to shoot fish with the bow, and he'd even brought a few triple-point barbed fish heads glued onto the ends of shafts and without feathers, just for small fish at a very short range. But this was slightly different than the northern pike was too big for little fish points because of the spread of the 3 points. They wouldn't go into the big fish very far. It would just wound it, and the arrow would fall off, and the fish thrashed around it would get away. He would have to get a solid arrow with a field point on the head of the fish to kill it, and he lined up all wrong for the kill. He was skirting the lake, heading north, when the lily pads on the right of the canoe, and since he shot right-handed, it was awkward to pick up the bow and swing it to the right and get a shot without exposing his whole body, which would probably scare the fish away. The same problem existed as he raised himself in the canoe and tried to turn around and face the other way to get a shot. He had the cargo bundle in front of him with all of his gear, and he was sitting in the rear of the canoe. If he tried to rise and turn, he would undoubtedly scare the fish away. And besides, with the way that he was kneeling and with a small amount of room, it would be almost impossible to turn. Still, it was early in the day, and there was plenty of light left, plenty of time before he stopped for the night. He crouched down towards the front of the canoe, and with careful, extremely slow motions of the paddle, he took almost 10 crawling minutes to turn the canoe around so that it was facing the other way. Just like so much of what he did now, so much of how he hunted. It was a stalking procedure. He had learned long ago that to hurry is to lose. Patience is the key, the absolute most important thing to hunting anything, from fish to moose. You needed to take your time required. When he was learning more about the North Country, he read the Inuits hunting seal on the ice would squat over the seal breathing hole for hours and even days, waiting for the seal to come up from the hole to get air. The Inuit would put a small piece of feather over the hole and stand with bone harpoon ready, and when the seal came into the hole, the air pushing ahead of its body would ruffle the feather, and the hunter would lunge with a harpoon and bury the barbed head in the back of the seal. The seal might weigh 400 pounds, and the harpoon didn't kill it, but it was merely attached to a line that the Inuit was holding, so the whole process was very dramatic. Like trying to hold a good-sized bull with a piece of string. The hunter had to hold the seal with one hand and probe with another killing spear to kill the seal while it was still trying to pull the hunter down through the ice and the water. Needless to say, it didn't always work, and he read that hunters were so patient that the seal never came or they lost it after the first strike that they would not be frustrated but merely shrug and go to the next hole. And Brian learned polar bears hunted seals the same way. The bear waited by the hole for a seal to come and take a breath, squinting so its eyes couldn't give away and covering its black nose with its paw for the same reason. And when the seal came, the bear lunged down, grabbed it by the nose, pulling its entire 300 to 400-pound seal up through the 6-inch hole of the ice, pulverizing it, turning the insides of the seal to a kind of a stew. It took the kind of patience. Brian crouched, peeking over the edge of the canoe in the northern all the while, barely moving the paddle until the canoe had completely swapped ends. Looking from beneath the water, he hoped, like a slowly drifting and turning log. It must have worked. Once the fish seemed about to move, its back arched and its gills flared where the smaller northern came by, and Brian could see it was merely defending its territory. At last the canoe was positioned right, and the northern was still there. It was slightly better placed because the lily pad was partially covering the fish's eyes. The bow was strung and still crouched forward. Brian gently slid the wooden arrow out of the quiver and laid it across the bow, notched it into the string, put his left hand on the handle, and raised the bow, even with the gunwale of the canoe, then a little higher so that the arrow would just clear the side of the canoe. Then, holding the bow almost sideways, he pushed it while pulling the arrow back, tucked the feathers under his chin, aimed at the bottom edge of the fish to allow for refraction. He'd learned that the hard way by missing the fish when he first started hunting after the plane crash. He released the arrow. The arrow was slowed only by a tiny amount so that it traveled through the water and hit the northern with full force just above the right eye. Whether by luck or design, it was almost perfect shot, and the shaft slammed through the brain, cutting the spinal cord, stopping halfway through the northern. The fish, dead in an instant, gave a spasmodic death jerk, and sideways arching its back, which flung it off in the shallower water, perhaps 5 feet deep. It became still and began to sink, the buoyancy of the wooden shaft slowing the process. "Ah," Brian said aloud, "I thought it might float. All fish have air bladders, which they use to control their depth, and sometimes when they are killed, they have enough air in the bladder to make them rise to the surface. Sometimes, as with this northern, the air expelled and they sank." Brian was wearing only shorts, and he put his hand on each side of the canoe and jumped himself over the side into the water. He slipped beneath the surface, and his eyes opened, and through his vision was blurred, and the northern color made it almost impossible to see. The arrow shaft was a bright white line. He grabbed it and pulled the fish up the canoe and flopped it over into the boat. "Thank you," he thought, as he always thought when he killed, and then, "good meal, full meal." And when he had come to think of it as can't walk meal or lie down and sleep meal. He could not save fish for the summer. If he had a smokehouse or a way to dry the meat without flies getting it, he might be able to keep some. But in the late summer heat, with no refrigeration, it was almost impossible to keep meat for a very long time. And he tried and he ate spoiled fish. It could easily kill him. He had found a government book on the internet that had been put out for farmers and hunters and trappers back in the 1930s. It cataloged and described each kind of meat and how to raise the different animals and how to slaughter them and preserve them. There were many surprises, such as the fact that venison and especially moose meat were very low in nutritional value and protein, while rabbit was the highest. He learned that fish meat was vulnerable to botulism, which was almost fatal. And they documented cases of Native Americans dying and eating dried salmon and other fish because of their poisons. They had also had many cases of predators, scavenger birds like eagles and wolves and foxes and coyotes been found dead from eating bad fish that had died and drifted up on shore. So when he would eat fish, the whole fish, he smiled, remembering the first fish, and how small it had been and how wonderful it had tasted. He still felt the same way about it. He still felt wonder at the food, and he looked for a clearing on the bank to make a fire. Good meal, full meal, thank you. That is chapter 2 of Brian's Hunt.